The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Dorian Gray, a young man of extraordinary beauty, becomes the muse of artist Basil Hallward, who paints his portrait. Influenced by the cynical and decadent worldview of Lord Henry Wotton, Dorian makes a fateful wish for eternal youth, with the portrait bearing the marks of his age and sins instead. Over time, Dorian leads a hedonistic and immoral life, and while his appearance remains youthful and unblemished, the portrait becomes increasingly grotesque, reflecting his inner corruption. Guilt haunts him, but in the end, his attempt to destroy the portrait leads to his own death, restoring the portrait's beauty. Let's deep dive into the book. Dorian Gray. A young and handsome man, Dorian Gray, becomes the muse of painter Basil Hallward, who creates a portrait that captures Dorian's extraordinary beauty. Dorian, influenced by Lord Henry Wotton, becomes infatuated with the idea of preserving his youth and innocence. He makes a wish that he could remain young while the portrait ages in his place. The wish is mysteriously granted, setting the stage for his moral decline. Dorian lives a life of indulgence, and while he remains physically unblemished, the portrait reflects his inner corruption and the consequences of his actions. Lord Henry's influence. Lord Henry Wotton plays a pivotal role in Dorian's transformation. He is a charismatic aristocrat with a cynical worldview who believes in the pursuit of pleasure above all else. His hedonistic philosophy captivates Dorian, encouraging him to embrace a life of excess and disregard for moral consequences. Henry dismisses conventional morality, asserting that beauty and sensual experience are the only things that matter. Under his influence, Dorian begins to detach himself from any sense of personal responsibility, leading him down a dark path of self-indulgence and cruelty. The fall of Sybil Vane. Dorian becomes enamored with Sybil Vane, a young actress whose beauty and talent captivate him. He views her as a perfect embodiment of art and romance, but when she performs poorly in a play, he cruelly rejects her, believing her real-life flaws diminish her artistic worth. Heartbroken, Sybil commits suicide. This tragedy marks the first major turn in Dorian's moral downfall. Despite initial guilt, he ultimately dismisses it under Lord Henry's influence. The portrait begins to show the first signs of his internal decay, with a slight cruelty emerging in its expression. The portrait's corruption. As Dorian immerses himself deeper in a life of vice, the portrait becomes a grotesque representation of his soul. While he remains outwardly beautiful and youthful, the painting reveals the true nature of his character. The once handsome face in the portrait turns cruel, aged, and monstrous. Dorian hides the portrait in a locked room to keep his secret from the world. His increasing detachment from his own conscience allows him to commit ever worse deeds, including manipulating others and engaging in various immoral acts, knowing that the consequences will manifest only in the portrait, not in himself. Basil's confrontation. Basil Hallward, the artist who painted the portrait and Dorian's once close friend, becomes concerned with the rumors of Dorian's immoral behavior. He confronts Dorian, pleading with him to reform and live a better life. Dorian, in a moment of anger and desperation, reveals the now hideous portrait to Basil, shocking him. Basil, horrified by the extent of Dorian's corruption, tries to convince him to repent. However, Dorian, unable to face his own guilt and angered by Basil's accusations, murders him in cold blood. This act marks a point of no return in Dorian's moral disintegration. The consequences of murder. After killing Basil, Dorian seeks to cover up the crime by blackmailing an old acquaintance, Alan Campbell, into disposing of the body. The weight of his sins begins to grow unbearable, yet he refuses to take responsibility for his actions. Dorian continues his life of decadence, trying to escape the guilt that haunts him. Alan, driven to despair by Dorian's manipulation, eventually commits suicide. Dorian's inner turmoil intensifies. but he pushes forward in his quest for new experiences, all while his portrait becomes ever more grotesque, embodying the consequences of his crimes. James Vane's revenge. James Vane, Sybil's brother, seeks revenge for his sister's death. He learns of Dorian's involvement and becomes obsessed with tracking him down. Years have passed, but Dorian's unchanged youthful appearance protects him, as James cannot believe this man could be the one responsible for his sister's death. However, James later realizes the truth and confronts Dorian. Dorian narrowly escapes being killed by James, but the encounter leaves him shaken. Despite his brush with death, Dorian is unable to fully confront the consequences of his actions, and his descent into moral decay continues. Dorian's attempt at redemption. Haunted by his crimes and the ever-worsening portrait, Dorian tries to reform. He ends a relationship with a woman to avoid corrupting her, believing this act of mercy might redeem him. However, upon seeing no change in the portrait, Dorian realizes that superficial acts of goodness cannot erase the deep corruption of his soul. Despair sets in as he becomes increasingly aware that his efforts to reform are futile. The portrait remains a constant reminder of his sins, and he begins to feel trapped by the irreversible consequences of his past choices. The final confrontation. Overcome with guilt and frustration, Dorian decides that the only way to free himself from the burden of the portrait is to destroy it. In a fit of rage, he takes a knife and stabs the painting, hoping to sever the connection between his soul and the grotesque image. This act proves fatal for Dorian. In destroying the portrait, he inadvertently kills himself. His body is found on the floor, aged and hideous, while the portrait returns to its original state of youthful beauty. This final act symbolizes the inescapable consequences of Dorian's pursuit of vanity and self-indulgence. Dorian's death. The novel concludes with Dorian's death, which serves as the ultimate consequence of his hedonistic and immoral lifestyle. Those who find his body, including his servants, are shocked to see the horrific transformation he has undergone. The portrait, now restored to its original beauty, stands as a haunting reminder of what Dorian once was. In the end, Dorian's pursuit of eternal youth and beauty leads to his tragic downfall, and the restoration of the portrait underscores the futility of trying to escape the natural consequences of time, age, and moral decay. Let's meet together the main characters of the book. Dorian Gray is the protagonist of the novel, a handsome young man whose wish for eternal youth leads to his moral corruption. Initially innocent and impressionable, he becomes consumed by vanity and the pursuit of pleasure. As his actions grow increasingly immoral, the portrait of him becomes a reflection of his decaying soul. Despite moments of guilt and attempts at redemption, Dorian is unable to escape the consequences of his actions, ultimately leading to his tragic demise. Lord Henry Wotton is a manipulative and charismatic figure who introduces Dorian to a hedonistic worldview. His philosophy of indulging in pleasure without regard for morality greatly influences Dorian's behavior throughout the novel. Although he never directly participates in Dorian's immoral actions, his ideas set the stage for Dorian's downfall. Lord Henry is both a catalyst and an observer, representing the dangerous allure of unchecked influence. Basil Hallward is the artist who paints Dorian's portrait and serves as a moral counterpoint to Lord Henry. He views Dorian as his muse and is deeply infatuated with his beauty, believing it brings out the best in his art. Unlike Lord Henry, Basil is concerned with Dorian's well-being and attempts to steer him toward a more virtuous path. His murder by Dorian symbolizes the final severing of any moral restraint in Dorian's life. James Vane is the brother of Sybil Vane, who seeks revenge on Dorian after her tragic death. His pursuit of justice represents the consequences of Dorian's actions coming back to haunt him. Although Dorian manages to avoid retribution for most of the novel, James's relentless pursuit reminds him that he cannot completely escape the consequences of his past. Let's explore together the main themes and concepts of the book. Eternal youth and beauty. Oscar Wilde explores the dangers of obsession with physical appearance and eternal youth. Dorian's wish to remain youthful reflects society's preoccupation with beauty, leading to his moral degradation. The portrait, which ages and becomes grotesque in his place, symbolizes the inevitable decay that Dorian tries to avoid. His unchanging appearance enables his hedonistic lifestyle, but comes at the cost of his soul. The novel warns that the pursuit of eternal beauty without moral consideration leads to inner corruption, as Dorian sacrifices his conscience and relationships for the illusion of youth. Hedonism and moral consequences. Under Lord Henry's influence, Dorian adopts a philosophy of hedonism, prioritizing pleasure and self-indulgence above all else. Wilde examines the consequences of a life lived without moral boundaries, where the pursuit of pleasure leads to a disconnect from personal responsibility. Dorian's actions, including betrayal, manipulation, and murder, are reflections of this extreme philosophy. The novel suggests that the absence of moral restraint, as represented by Dorian's lifestyle, leads to destruction. Wilde presents hedonism as an alluring but dangerous path, with the corrupted portrait serving as a visual representation of the toll it takes on the soul. Influence and manipulation. The theme of influence is central to the relationship between Dorian and Lord Henry. Henry manipulates Dorian's worldview, introducing him to a philosophy that disregards moral consequences. Dorian, once innocent, becomes a product of Henry's cynical views, and his actions throughout the novel are shaped by this influence. Wilde explores how individuals can be molded by the ideas of others, for better or worse. Henry's influence over Dorian is portrayed as destructive, and the novel highlights the dangers of blindly accepting the philosophies of others without considering their implications on one's moral compass. The nature of the soul. Wilde delves into the concept of the soul and its connection to one's outward appearance. Dorian's soul becomes tied to the portrait, which reflects the degradation of his character. As Dorian commits immoral acts, the portrait changes, growing more monstrous and revealing the true state of his inner self. The novel suggests that one's physical appearance cannot hide the corruption of the soul, and Dorian's attempt to separate his soul from his outward image ultimately leads to his downfall. Wilde raises questions about the nature of identity and the inevitable connection between inner morality and external actions. Art and aesthetics. Art plays a significant role in the Picture of Dorian Gray, particularly through the portrait that reflects Dorian's inner life. Wilde explores the relationship between life and art, with Dorian's beauty becoming an artistic ideal that leads to his moral destruction. Basil's portrait of Dorian captures his essence, and the idea that art can reveal deeper truths is central to the novel. Wilde also comments on the aesthetic movement, which prioritizes beauty and art over morality. Dorian's downfall serves as a critique of the belief that art and beauty exist independently of ethics, suggesting that aestheticism without moral grounding is ultimately hollow. Let's talk about the author. Oscar Wilde was a prominent Irish playwright, poet, and author best known for his wit and flamboyant style. Born in 1854, Wilde became a key figure in the aesthetic movement, which emphasized art for art's sake. His only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, sparked controversy for its themes of hedonism and moral decay. Wilde's sharp social commentary also found success in his plays, such as The Importance of Being Earnest. He was known for his wit and satire, often criticizing societal norms. Wilde's career was cut short by his imprisonment for gross indecency, after which he lived in exile until his death in 1900. Sincere thanks for watching. If you found this summary helpful, consider taking a moment to hit the subscribe button, like or share the video. If you have any feedbacks or book requests, make sure to leave a comment. Regardless, I wish you a great day.